They questioned his first-class ticket, asked him to step aside, and whispered behind his back. But none of them realized he was a federal investigator documenting every second. Terence Dillard didn't look like someone trying to prove anything. He wasn't flashy, didn't wear labels, and didn't need to. A dark grey sport coat over a crisp white shirt, navy slacks, leather shoes shined to a soft gleam. Everything about him spoke of a man who knew who he was and had nothing to prove to anyone. Gate 10 at Dallas. Love Field was buzzing with pre-flight chatter as usual. The loudspeaker called first-class passengers for Flight 265 to Seattle. Terence stood, adjusted the strap on his leather briefcase, and walked toward the boarding lane marked Priority. He waited patiently behind a young white couple in fleece hoodies and sandals. The agent smiled and scanned their tickets without a second glance. Then came Terence's turn. He stepped forward, offered a small smile, and handed over his boarding pass. The flight attendant, a blonde woman in her mid-40s with a stiff ponytail and tired eyes, looked down at the screen, then back up at him, then down again. "Are you sure this is your seat, sir?" she asked, her voice a little too loud. Terence gave a polite nod. "Yes, ma'am. Seat 2A. First class." She didn't scan the ticket. She just stood there, blinking like her screen had frozen. "I'll just need to double-check something real quick," she said, then turning away. "Can you just step aside for a moment?" There it was, the shift. Small but sharp. Not a hard no. Not yet, but enough to make people glance up. Enough to draw attention that didn't need to be drawn. Terence moved to the side, calm on the surface. Inside, he felt that familiar flicker. Not anger. Not yet. Just a deep, internal sigh. He'd seen this kind of thing before, more times than he could count. But this time it wasn't just happening to him. It was happening while he was on duty. Even if no one around him knew it yet. He watched the line move forward. No one else was questioned. A teenager in an oversized hoodie strolled past and scanned in without a word. A man in a faded fishing cap winked at the flight attendant as he passed. She chuckled, scanned him in, and didn't even glance at his name. Terence checked his watch. He wasn't in a rush. He had blocked off the entire day for this trip, and if anything, delays only added to the report he was mentally filing. The first-class line emptied. The woman returned, now with another attendant, younger, maybe mid-30s, redhead, wearing an expression somewhere between suspicion and confusion. They both looked at his boarding pass, then at each other. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're just trying to verify your seat assignment," the second woman said. Terence kept his voice low and even. "What exactly are you verifying?" The older attendant shifted. "We're just not seeing this seat under your name in the system. It's probably a mix-up. Happens sometimes." He gently retrieved the boarding pass from her hand and held it up. "My name is Terence Dillard. Seat 2A. TSA pre-check. And yes, I booked directly through the airline's website. Same as always." The second attendant's smile was tight. "It's probably just a glitch. Like she said, just need to confirm it with the supervisor. It'll be quick." He gave a short nod and stepped further to the side. Behind him, a few passengers whispered. Someone 2 rows back laughed under their breath. One man muttered, "Knew this would happen," just loud enough for Terence to hear. He said nothing, just stood, watching the gate agent pick up a phone and make a quiet call. Watching people glance his way, then look away quickly, pretending not to see. He adjusted the strap on his briefcase again. Not out of nerves, but routine. People saw a man standing alone at a gate, being questioned, and they filled in the blanks themselves. They always did. But that hesitation was only the beginning. Terence had stood there for 6 minutes. That might not sound like much, but in airport time, especially when you're being watched like you don't belong, it stretches long and uncomfortable, long enough for passengers to finish their drinks, adjust their headphones, and whisper little comments without even trying to lower their voices. The gate agent hung up the phone and turned back to him with the same practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Our supervisor is on the way. Just a moment longer." Terence gave a simple nod. Still composed, still quiet. Behind him, a middle-aged man in cargo shorts and a Seahawks cap leaned over to the person next to him and said, Guess first class ain't for everyone. The person chuckled. Terence caught it. Of course he did. But he let it go. He'd spent years mastering that, filtering out noise, swallowing pride without losing himself. That was what his mother taught him. Never let small people pull you out of your place. Then another attendant came from the jet bridge. This one older, grey hair, tall, looked like she'd been with the airline for decades. She didn't introduce herself, didn't offer a greeting, just walked up and said, "What seems to be the issue here?" The redhead jumped in. "We're having trouble verifying his seat assignment. It's not matching in the system." The older woman took the boarding pass from Terence, looked it over for less than 3 seconds, then turned to the screen. She typed something, frowned, hit a few more keys. "It says 2A, she muttered. "Paid upgrade. Booked with rewards and cash. System shows confirmed." Terence raised an eyebrow slightly. "So," the woman turned to him, "you can go ahead. Sorry for the delay." But even now, there was no apology for what caused the delay. No recognition of the way he'd been pulled aside, held up, stared at, quietly insulted. Just those 4 words. "You can go ahead." Terence gave a nod. Not of thanks, but acknowledgement. As he moved forward, the man in the Seahawks hat leaned back in his seat and added, "Guess it worked out for you after all, huh?" Terence didn't respond. He wasn't there to argue with small minds. He was there to watch, to record, and to remember. As he walked down the jet bridge, the flight attendant from earlier hurried alongside him. "We just want to make sure everyone's in the right seat," she said, trying to sound casual. "You understand." Terence looked at her, his voice calm but sharp. "Do you say that to every first-class passenger, or just the ones that make you double-check?" She blinked, caught off guard by the directness. Well, it's just protocol." He stepped ahead of her, entering the plane. "Then you might want to update your protocol." The flight attendant didn't follow him further. A male flight crew member welcomed him aboard, barely glancing at his boarding pass. "Right this way, 2A, he said. Terence took his seat. Window view. Clean, spacious. He placed his briefcase under the seat and sat back, eyes steady, mind racing. Across the aisle, a young white man in a Patagonia jacket scrolled through his phone, glanced at Terence, then looked away. Not a word. That's how it usually went. A moment of tension, then silence. Everyone pretending nothing happened. The plane moved on. Life moved on. But Terence wasn't just a passenger today. He was an observer, an auditor. And his job wasn't to move on. It was to pay attention. The flight crew began making their rounds. A drink cart squeaked into motion. Champagne was offered to all first-class guests. A small gesture, maybe standard. But it didn't feel standard anymore. Terence accepted a glass, not out of interest, but to stay in character. He sipped, checked the seat pocket for the safety card, folded it open, and slipped a business card between the pages. A quiet breadcrumb, just in case. Outside the window, the baggage crew zipped around in orange vests. He watched them while the final passengers boarded. A family with 2 kids shuffled past, loud and tired. A college student in a hoodie with headphones bumped into the seat ahead of him and didn't apologize. The flight attendant smiled at them all, cheerful as ever. No second glances, no checks, no just making sure tones. Only him. Only Terence had earned that treatment today. But none of them had any idea who Terence really was. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane doors closed. The captain's voice came over the speakers with the usual pre-flight chatter. Flight time just under 4 hours. Smooth weather expected over the Rockies. Thank you for flying with us. Terence barely heard a word of it. He sat still, hands resting on his thighs, feeling the memory of that brief confrontation stretch behind his eyes like a tight rope. He'd been through similar situations before, at restaurants, in lobbies, even in courthouse elevators. But this one hit different. This one wasn't just personal. It was evidence. He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a plain, matte black smartphone. Not his regular phone. This one was agency-issued. No social apps, no contacts, just notes, secure messaging, and a camera with audio time-stamping. He typed slowly. methodically. Subject: Flight 265. Dial to sea time, 3:42 p.m. Incident: boarding obstruction without cause. Details: flight crew questioned seat validity without checking system. Supervisor confirmed booking in less than 30 seconds. No apology issued. Delay duration: minutes. Tone: patronizing. Secondary reactions from passengers: mocking, dismissive. He locked the phone and slid it back in his pocket. Across the aisle, the same young man from earlier, Patagonia jacket, AirPods in, leaned his seat back and closed his eyes. A woman 2 rows behind unwrapped a protein bar with exaggerated crinkles. The world kept spinning. A male flight attendant came by offering warm towels. "Here you go, sir," he said to Terence, with a cheerful nod that came a few beats too late to feel natural. Terence accepted the towel and placed it untouched on the tray table. That performative kindness, it was always there, once you were no longer a problem. They smooth it over with small gestures, thinking it erases the disrespect that came before, as if a moist towelette could wash off the memory of being treated like a trespasser in a space you paid for. 15 minutes passed. The engines fired up. The plane began its slow crawl to the runway. Terence glanced around the cabin. An older white man behind him was already asleep, mouth open. A businesswoman typed something quickly on her laptop, frowning at a spreadsheet. The world didn't pause. Not for indignity, not for discomfort, not even for the truth. Then, something caught his eye. Row 4, right side. A mother in her late 50s, brown skin, short curly hair, was making her way to the back with a toddler. Her boarding pass was in her hand. Her economy seat was farther down. She'd asked a flight attendant if she could just stand in first class with the child for a moment while he calmed down. The attendant, same redhead from the gate, shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mom, but this is the first class section. You'll need to move back now." "But I'm not asking to sit, just standing, just for a minute." "Ma'am," the attendant said, louder this time, "you're blocking the aisle. You need to return to your seat." Terence watched her shoulders drop. She gave a quiet, "Sorry," and walked down the aisle with the boy now squirming in her arms. 2 rows later, a white teenage boy came up from coach and leaned across a first-class seat to speak to someone. No one stopped him. No one asked him to move. Terence took another note. People think discrimination always screams. Sometimes it whispers. In who's allowed to bend the rules and who's forced to obey every letter of them. The plane taxied to the runway. The cabin rattled gently, then lifted into the sky. Terence turned to the window and watched the buildings shrink away beneath them. Then he closed his eyes for the first time since boarding. He didn't sleep. He thought. About his job. About how often people asked if what he did even mattered. About the times people told him, things aren't like that anymore. But it was only the first hour of the flight, and already he had more than enough to report. But the clock was ticking, and the audit had already begun. About an hour into the flight, the seatbelt sign blinked off and passengers started settling in. Terence kept his tray up, hands folded, mind sharp. His job today was to observe, not just what was said out loud, but everything that wasn't. Body language, side glances, hesitations, all of it. The same red-headed flight attendant reappeared, now all smiles and soft tone. "Can I get you something to drink, mister?" She glanced at the manifest in her hand, pretending to check, even though she already knew. "Dillard," he answered evenly. "Just water." "Of course. And thank you for your patience earlier. We had a little tech hiccup at the gate. These things happen, you know." She gave a polite laugh, the kind that asked him to let it all go. Terence smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Do they?" The smile on her face faltered for a second, like a crack in plaster. He leaned back in his seat and added, "Interesting that the hiccup only seemed to apply to me. None of the other passengers in the first-class line were asked to wait." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, she turned and went to fetch the water. That was when the passenger across the aisle leaned in slightly. Grey blazer, silver hair, maybe early 60s. He looked like the kind of guy who played tennis on weekends and golfed during the week. "Didn't mean to overhear," the man said, voice low. "But I saw what happened back at the gate. Bit ridiculous, if you ask me." Terence turned to him. "Appreciate you saying that." "Yeah. They didn't question anyone else. Felt like they were checking something that had nothing to do with a boarding pass." Terence nodded once. "You're not wrong." The man paused. "You fly often?" "I do," Terence replied. The water arrived. The flight attendant placed it gently on his tray like it was fragile glass. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, eyes flickering. Terence waited until she walked off. Then he reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out his ID. It wasn't the usual kind. No fancy badge, no shiny emblem, just a clear federal credential with his name, title, and agency. Terence Dillard, Senior Investigator, U.S. Department of Transportation, Office of Civil Rights and Aviation Compliance. He held it out briefly toward the silver-haired man, who blinked as he read it. "I'm not just a passenger," Terence said. "I'm auditing this flight." The man's face went blank for a beat. Then he let out a short breath. "Well, damn," Terence chuckled lightly. "Yeah. You do this often?" "Often enough. We run random, unscheduled assessments, see how people are treated, who gets flagged, who gets overlooked, what the patterns are." The man sat back. "And what do you do when you see it happening right in front of you?" "Document it," Terence replied. "And sometimes, if it's blatant enough, we escalate." A few rows ahead, the flight attendant handed a beer to a passenger who made a joke loud enough to reach halfway down the cabin. Something about flying being the last place where people know their place. The joke landed hard with the guy next to him. Terence didn't laugh. He took another sip of water and typed 2 more lines in his phone. He knew better than to confront crew mid-flight. That wasn't the point. He wasn't here to humiliate anyone. He was here to observe how people behave when they think no one's watching closely. And today, they'd shown him plenty. An hour later, the flight crew distributed meals. Terence was suddenly offered a complimentary upgrade. "We'd like to thank you for your loyalty," the redhead said, flashing a new version of her smile. He took the meal, but said nothing. Let the silence do its work. But Terence wasn't finished collecting data, not by a long shot. The scent of reheated chicken and buttered rolls drifted through the cabin, mixing with stale air and half-hearted conversation. Passengers around Terence had mostly settled into their routines, movies playing on tiny seatback screens, phones glowing in tray tables, heads leaned back in silence. Terence picked at his meal without much appetite. He didn't need food right now. He needed patterns, and he was seeing them, clear as daylight. The redhead made another round, asking each first-class passenger if they needed anything else. Her smile stiffened when she reached Terence again. "All good here?" she asked. Terence met her gaze. "So far." She moved on quickly. He glanced toward the divider curtain separating first class from economy. It shifted with every step the crew took, opening briefly to reveal slivers of life on the other side. That's where he noticed her. Row 19, aisle seat. An elderly Latina woman with weathered hands and a neck pillow tucked behind her. Her cardigan looked handmade, faded lavender, and she clutched a small paper bag like it contained something fragile. Every time the flight attendant passed, the woman raised her hand slightly. Not boldly, just enough to be noticed. And every time, she was skipped. The attendants walked past her like she wasn't there. Meanwhile, a white teenager in 21B, earbuds in, socks on the seat in front of him, got an extra ginger ale without asking. No hesitation, no delay. Terence tapped his notes. Observed. Passenger in 19C requested assistance multiple times. No response. Neighbor received double service. He knew what this looked like, what it meant. Bias rarely arrived shouting. It came as silence. It came in who was seen and who wasn't. Then, something else. From 2 rows behind the woman, a voice, low, frustrated. "Yo, excuse me." "Hello?" Terence sat up straighter. A young black man in his 20s stood halfway into the aisle. Denim jacket, short haircut, polite tone, but clear frustration in his voice. He was holding a carry-on bag that wouldn't fit in the overhead bin. "I just need to check if there's space in the front. This one's jammed," he said to the passing crew member. The flight attendant paused, didn't look at him right away. She sighed. "You need to sit down, sir. We'll handle that when we have time." "I've been trying since we boarded." "Well, that's not my problem, is it?" she replied, still not meeting his eyes. Terrence's eyebrows lifted. There it was again. The tone. No raised voice, no curse words, but the instant shift in demeanor, like she'd flipped a switch the moment she saw who was talking. The young man opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. He looked around, suddenly aware that people were watching, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. That pause was a choice, not wanting to be labeled, not wanting to be that guy mid-flight. He slowly sat down, the bag crammed awkwardly between his feet. The attendant walked away without a word. Terrence tapped his phone twice. Hit record. He captured the interaction. Didn't speak. Didn't move. Just documented. He knew this report was going to be longer than expected. He looked around again. 2 white passengers had wandered into the first-class curtain earlier. One to ask about flight duration, the other to request a pillow. Neither had been told to return to their seats. No tension. No sighs. No problem. Terrence closed the note-taking app and leaned back, letting the weight of what he'd seen settle. None of this surprised him. That's what made it worse. His job wasn't about catching people in the act. It was about proving, in black and white, what so many still denied. That some passengers are handled, others are helped, and most days it depended entirely on who was doing the asking. But back in economy, something happened that made him press record. The tension in the cabin was quiet, but thick. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it, unless you'd lived through it before. Terrence had, more times than he could count. He kept his phone recording as he shifted in his seat, eyes still on the young man in row 21. He looked barely 25. Clean cut. The kind of tired that came from trying too hard not to cause trouble. He kept adjusting his legs, trying to find a way to sit comfortably, with the oversized carry-on crammed under the seat in front of him. It wasn't working. About 20 minutes later, the same flight attendant returned to his row with the drink cart. She glanced down and paused. "You can't have that there, sir," she said, tapping the bag with her pen. "It has to go in the overhead or be checked." He looked up. "I told you it doesn't fit. I tried. No one helped me." Her voice got sharp. "That's not my fault. You're blocking the aisle space. We can't continue service with this here." I asked. "Twice when we boarded," he said, trying to stay calm. "You're being difficult," she snapped. "I'll need to notify the captain if you can't follow basic instructions." That did it. A woman across the aisle set her magazine down and looked over. The older lady in 19C clutched her bag a little tighter. Passengers started glancing up again. Whispers crept in. Terrence's phone stayed steady in his hand. Screen dimmed. He zoomed in just enough to catch the exchange clearly. The young man stood up, hands raised slightly, not aggressively, just open, as if to show he wasn't a threat. "Look," he said. "I didn't pack the bins. I just asked for help, that's it." The attendant took a step back. "Sir, I'm going to need you to take your seat immediately or you may be removed when we land." He froze for a second, looked around. No one spoke. Not one person. Terrence's jaw tightened slightly. He'd seen this exact moment before. The quiet crowd, the worried glances, the everyone just wants to get home silence. People who claimed to be allies in conversation turned to window watchers when it mattered. The young man slowly sat back down, his voice low now. "Man, I didn't even raise my voice." The attendant marched away without another word. Terrence stopped the recording and saved the file. Then he stood. He walked calmly to the back of the cabin and requested a moment with the lead attendant. A tall man with kind eyes met him near the galley. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked. Terrence showed his credentials without saying a word. The man took a second, scanned it, and blinked. Are you—" he lowered his voice. "This flight is under review?" Terrence nodded. "Unannounced audit. documenting service patterns and discriminatory conduct. The man looked away, suddenly very aware of who had been working which sections. I understand, he said quietly. I'll let the crew know you're on board. No need. Terence replied. They'll find out soon enough. Back at his seat, the young man was now sitting completely still, shoulders hunched, staring ahead. Terence sat back down, opened a new note and wrote, Incident escalation observed. Passenger labeled difficult after multiple ignored requests. Threatened with removal for non-compliance with an impossible request. He paused, added, No intervention from crew. No support from surrounding passengers. Silence. He watched the sky out the window for a moment, the clouds layered like torn pages. Then he turned back to his screen, flipped through past entries, and shook his head once. It was almost always the same story. Different faces, different cities, same script. But once the plane landed, Terence made one call. The wheels touched down on the tarmac at Seattle-Tacoma International with a soft thud, and the cabin gave the usual quiet applause from the passengers who still felt the need to thank gravity. Terence didn't clap. He simply shut off airplane mode and tapped open the secure app on his agency device. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began stirring, unbuckling early, grabbing jackets from overhead bins, pretending not to make eye contact with anyone they might have silently judged or ignored. Terence typed the final details into his audit log. Then he made the call. Office of Aviation Compliance. This is Colleen. It's Dillard. Flight 265. Completed. Colleen didn't need more than that. Report coming today? Yes. And video attachments as well. She paused. That quick? It's not a long flight when they hand you a case in the first 30 minutes. Back in his seat, the redhead passed by one last time. Her smile was gone now, replaced with something more cautious. She nodded slightly but said nothing. Terence stood and reached for his briefcase. The young man from row 21 also stood, rubbing his knee, trying to maneuver his oversized bag out from under the seat. He looked tired. Not physically, but the kind of tired that sits on your shoulders after you've spent hours swallowing disrespect just to avoid a scene. Terence met his eyes briefly, gave a look that said, I saw it. All of it. The young man gave a tiny nod back. Just that. Nothing else. They exited the plane separately. At the terminal, Terence stepped aside and pulled out his regular phone. He took a moment, then opened the notepad where he kept a different kind of record. One for himself. Seattle. Bias confirmed. Crew escalation patterns match prior incidents. Passenger treated as threat despite compliance. Witness silence consistent. He saved the file, exhaled slowly, and headed toward the escalators. By the end of the week, his full report was filed. Names were anonymized, video footage reviewed, timestamps analyzed. What the airline didn't know, not yet, was that this flight had become a case study. Not because of a massive blow-up, not because of a headline-grabbing incident, but because it revealed something far more common, far more dangerous, the pattern of everyday discrimination dressed up as procedure. 3 weeks later, the airline received a formal notice, a request for internal policy review. The crew from Flight 265 was called into meetings, some quiet, some not. HR terms were tossed around. One attendant resigned. 2 others were flagged for retraining, but none of that made the news. No public scandal, no press release, just another day behind the curtain of compliance. What did change was subtle. The airline added a new line to its first-class training module. Staff should be mindful of unconscious bias in seat verification procedures. It sounded bureaucratic, safe, tucked away between bullet points about boarding efficiency and customer service tone. But Terence saw it. He knew what it meant. It meant they'd been watched, and that someone, just one person, had felt the weight of accountability, even if only for a moment. He was back in D.C. when he got a short message from Colleen. Incident 265, flagged for recurring pattern. Seattle route under ongoing review. That was enough. Not everything, but enough for now, because Terence didn't do this work for attention. He didn't do it to go viral or start fights. He did it so fewer people would have to swallow the same silence he did. So the young man in row 21 wouldn't have to choose between being quiet and being labeled. So the woman in 19C wouldn't have to raise her hand again and be skipped. He closed the file, shut down his computer, and looked out the window of his small home office. Not at anything in particular, just the street, the world. The kind of ordinary moment where these stories begin, again and again. But for Terence, this was never about punishment. On Saturday morning, Terence sat at his kitchen table in Silver Spring, Maryland. No reports, no badge on the table, just him, a mug of black coffee, and the quiet hum of his refrigerator. He scrolled through the week's headlines: war, politics, another celebrity scandal. Nothing about Flight 265. No outrage, no statement from the airline, nothing. And that, he thought, is exactly why the work matters. He glanced over at the corner bookshelf, where a photo of his late mother sat framed in gold trim. Her smile always reminded him of Sundays, gospel music, and wisdom dressed up as casual advice. "Stay calm, baby," she used to say. "But never stay silent. Silence don't keep you safe. It just keeps you stuck." She knew something about being stuck. She'd worked for 38 years as a nurse in Cleveland. Always the one covering holiday shifts, always the one asked to explain herself twice. She never complained, but Terence remembered how her voice changed when she got home. Softer, like it had been carrying more weight than she let on. That's where he'd learned it. Not just how to carry himself, but when to speak and when to listen. He picked up his notebook and added a few thoughts. Not for the audit, just for himself. It's not the yelling that does the damage, it's the disbelief. The moments when you're told you're imagining it, that your experience is inconvenient, that maybe, just maybe, you overreacted. That was the real erosion, the wear and tear of always having to prove what you already know is true. His phone buzzed, a text from a friend who worked in transportation law. "Heard about your last audit. Subtle but sharp. Nicely done." Terence smiled. That was the goal. Not drama, not headlines, just proof. Documented, undeniable proof. He thought again of the young man in row 21, still probably thinking about that flight, still wondering if he did something wrong. Terence wished he could tell him, "No, you didn't. You were just too visible in a space that prefers you quiet. You were asking for help in a system that assumes you're asking for trouble." He thought of all the people who had stayed silent on that flight, the ones who saw, heard, and chose to look away. And he didn't blame them. Not completely. People get tired. People get scared. But silence is still a choice. Maybe that's the real lesson. That everyday bias doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's a shrug. A delay, a raised eyebrow at a boarding pass, a skipped hand in row 19. It's not always dramatic. That's what makes it dangerous. Terence didn't expect the world to change overnight, but it would never change at all if people kept pretending there wasn't a problem. And change, real change, starts small. With a look, a question, a moment of courage in a quiet place. He finished his coffee, stood up, and walked to the window. Outside, a kid was helping his grandfather unload groceries. Nothing big, just life, unfolding on its own time. And that's what Terence fought for. Not attention, not status. Just the right for people like him to move through life without being checked twice. Before stepping away, he opened his notes app one last time. To anyone who's ever been stared at for taking up space they paid for. You're not imagining it, and you're not alone. Stay calm, but never stay silent. If this story made you pause, made you think, or reminded you of something you've lived through, subscribe for more real stories. Stories that don't always make the news, but still need to be told.